Great. I'm going to kick us off. We might have a few more people joining. We're actually competing today with an apprenticeships hearing in the Senate Help Committee. So people might be watching that instead. Um, if anyone who's not, we'll send around a summary after this. So today we're going to be talking about completion. I'm just going to do a quick bit up front, introducing the session and our speakers. Quick bit of housekeeping up front. So this is being recorded. We'll put it on our YouTube channel and send it around afterwards. So no need to take any notes. And we'll have 10 minutes towards the end for questions from the audience. So if there's anything you want to pick up on as we're going along, please put it in the sidebar, and we'll try and come back to it at the end, or put your hand up at the end and come in. Brilliant. So I just wanted to say a little bit about why we wanted to talk about completion and retention up front. This is actually the second webinar we've done on completion in a short period. We did one a few months ago, hearing from some practitioners, Tony and Randy, about the supports they put in place to get high retention rates in their apprenticeship programs. But we wanted to come back to it as it's just so important, like to us as a trade association. We think this is something that, as a field, we've really got to focus on and improve on. The data, it's shaky. We think there's kind of slightly different ways of measuring things, but we think right now in the US, apprenticeship completion is around 42%. If you think about it, that means over half of employers are having an apprentice who is dropping out, and that means we need to work twice as hard. We're constantly persuading new employers to sign up. We're kind of making our recruitment job twice as hard. It's always, we're always trying to persuade the new employers rather than getting it returning customers because completion rates are so low. And just from a simple kind of expansion mass perspective, we know completion internationally is around 60 to 70%. Even just raising our retention rates in the US a little bit, not even all the way to that, would have a pretty significant impact on apprenticeship numbers. We could be keeping 50, 60,000 more people in the system every year with slightly better completion. So that's what we want to talk about today. So we're going to be hearing from a set of speakers who are going to be talking about research, best practice, tools, and their experiences of how to improve completion and retention rates. Got a great set of speakers and guests here today. Just to give really quick introductions, we've got Amy Bella, who many of you will know, who leads AIR's technical assistance work on apprenticeship. Gauri, also from AIR, who has led research on completion, retention, and apprenticeship, which she's going to speak about in just a minute. Then we have Jan van der Hoop. So Jan founded and runs a firm called Fit First Technologies. They've got some really interesting experience of using tech and data to help match people to jobs and to training programs, and they've seen some brilliant results in improving, dramatically improving completion rates, which I'm sure Jan's going to talk about later. And then last but not least, we've got Mel Winter, who's the Executive Director of Support Ontario Youth. So Mel runs apprenticeship programs for young people in the trades in Ontario. So she's going to talk about her experience, and she also works with Jan and Bit First Technologies. So she's going to share some first-hand experience of using data and tech to improve retention as well. Brilliant. That was all I was going to say up front. We're going to start with a bit of an overview of what the research says on completion from Guy and from Amy. So I'm going to pass over to you guys to kick us off.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Harry, for inviting us and having us on this completion webinar. It is very, very important topic, as we all know, trying to get our skilled workers from being an apprentice to skilled worker is really what we're trying to do here. So G's going to bring up our PowerPoint presentation today, and we're going to quickly go over. So let me tell you a little bit about AIR for those of you in the audience that do not know about us. AIR, we partner with public and private sectors to really look at some of the biggest challenges. We partner with national, state, and local levels to really advance apprenticeship. We have an integrated TA and research team that really help to provide real-time and actionable oriented learning. We have over 15 years of experience within the apprenticeship space that runs a whole gamut of places that we can help, between industry-informed apprenticeship program design, integrated research and technical assistance projects, apprenticeship registration experience, and then sector-specific workforce solutions. So enough about AIR. Let's talk about our partner that we partnered with this research project. The Electronic Training Alliance, which I will refer to as ETA throughout this presentation, and so will G. So when we talk about ETA, it's the Electronic Training Alliance. ETA was created over 70 years ago. They are a joint training program between the National Electrical Contractors Association, or NECA, and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, IBEW. And a little bit of background on AIR's partnership. We started our partnership back in 1992, so very long ago. We started talking about key roles within the electrical industry, such as inside wiremen, outside linemen, residential wiremen, and installer technician. Our main focus was to help the JATC, or the Joint Training Apprenticeship Training Committees, to select apprentices that had skills to succeed. So we did this by identifying knowledge, skills, and abilities needed for these jobs, and develop selection tools that were job relevant, legally defensible, and tailored to the electrical industry. We didn't stop just at selection materials. We also looked at skills and abilities that help to shape the apprenticeship training programs. So in the same result of the research and that supports hiring and informs the training curriculum. So we just didn't look at selection, we looked at how it would inform the training curriculum as well. And then we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to look at the retention. So we really wanted to study on what helps apprentices stay within their program and what challenges they face. We also looked at what impacts apprenticeship directors had, and we wanted to really see the whole program from selection to retention to completion. So today we're going to be sharing some insights from our apprenticeship retention study. So what was the problem? ETA supports over 40,000 inside wiremen each year, which that has an approximate network of 280 JATCs nationwide. They have close to a 70% completion rate, just like Harry was mentioning that 70% was more like the international average. That is an amazing retention rate, but that still says that 1/3 of their apprentices are not completing, and that was not good enough for them. They wanted to see how they can actually retain more of their apprentices as they go on. So consequently, we saw that there's three main reasons or results for these for individuals that did not complete. One was at the individual level or the apprentice level, and you'll hear these levels throughout G's presentation. So hone in on the three different levels that we have. So individual level or the apprentice level, those who didn't complete their program had unfinished investment of time and effort, and maybe even personal expense. At the programmatic level, so that's at the registered apprenticeship program level, once an apprentice is selected and they drop out of the program, they can't refill that person until the next cohort comes in. So they're seeing some of their costs being associated with training costs and putting time, energy, and effort into that apprentice that they'll never receive back. Then at the occupational level, it creates gaps and inefficiencies for the wider electrician workforce. So that workforce is not gaining that skilled worker as they go along. So I'm going to turn it over to G to give more of the background as to what we did in the study to really show how completion rates can be changed. So G, take it away.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. All right, so I'm going to dive into what we did in our work with the Electrical Training Alliance. So once we'd established the problem statement that Amy just talked about, ETA contracted our team at AIR to conduct a study that would help us better understand what are the factors that influence an apprentice's decision to remain in or withdraw from the program. Essentially, like what's helping them stay on to completion and what's hindering their chances of sticking with the program. And so we used a three-step approach to answer this question. We started off with a trends analysis. That was essentially us looking at existing data to identify any existing trends. We analyzed data that ETA already collects through their annual survey with training directors. And we wanted to see if any of this existing information gave us any kind of early clues about what's impacting apprentices voluntarily leaving the program. We simultaneously did a literature review, and Amy will pop a link in the chat that has a link to that comprehensive literature review. In this review, we researched kind of apprentice retention, existing literature on apprentice retention. And interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly to this group, we found very little US-based research on this topic. A lot of the research that we found was based out of Europe and Australia and New Zealand. As our third step, we really wanted to take an apprentice-centered approach to this work. And so we conducted surveys that focused on gathering information from the apprentices themselves. So we gathered survey data from current apprentices and those who did not complete the program. We kept these surveys super short. The survey for the non-completers was about 5 minutes, where the current apprentices didn't go beyond 15. And in the end, we received a little over 2,000 responses from current apprentices and almost 150 from those non-completers. And before we dive into, what were the helping factors, what were the hindering factors, I just want to go over a little bit of what we learned about the nature of retention. What we learned is that retention is a very dynamic process. It's not the case that an apprentice suddenly wakes up one day and goes, I'm not going to do this program anymore. It takes time. There's no necessarily one reason that impacts an apprentice's decision to leave their program. The factors that affect retention, they can be diverse and they can be interrelated. They also change over time. They can start as soon as day one of the apprentice's program. And also the factors that might impact an apprentice's decision to leave or to stay may be different in their first and second year versus their fourth and fifth year. So there's just a lot of variability. Also, these factors, they're specific to an individual based off of their own personal circumstances. They're also tied to the apprenticeship program itself. And then some factors are related to the actual occupation, the nature of the work, the culture of that occupation. What we found through our literature review and through our survey, it can be extremely challenging to rank order these factors. And what I mean by that is it's really challenging to say XYZ is the biggest kind of factor that affects an apprentice's experience. And just because it's such a dynamic process and those factors keep changing through the tenure of an apprentice's tenure through the program. So next, I'm going to dive into the factors that impact retention for the inside environment that we conducted our surveys for. As Amy said, I'll talk about these at different levels, right? So I'll start off with the factors at the individual level, then we'll talk about programmatic factors, and then factors that are tied to the broader occupation of inside wiremen and electricians. So starting off with individual level factors and the facilitators, essentially the helping factors, right? And having an optimistic outlook about the future was a big motivator for the apprentices. We learned that current apprentices reported that their future wages and the potential for career stability, followed by loving the work that they do, were top motivating factors for wanting to complete the program. And this quote that you see here was pulled from the open-ended responses from our survey, where they actually call out financial stability as something as they see as, it's going to be worth me putting in this investment right now for the future financial stability that I'm going to gain in the long run. In terms of challenges and barriers, transportation emerged as the primary issue for current apprentices, followed by a lack of familial and social support and challenges related to mental health and childcare. And just in the interest of time here, I'm going to go a little bit deeper on just that first bullet on transportation. More than half of our current apprentices reported that affording travel-related costs, so things like paying for gas or being able to afford overnight stays, that was a challenge. And almost a third reported that accessing transportation support for work travel was a challenge that they navigated. In the survey that was sent to folks who did not complete the apprenticeship program, for those non-completers, over a third reported that a lack of support for transportation really impacted them, and they would have really benefited from having support around transportation to get to their program, to get to work sites. At a programmatic level, more than 60% of our current apprentices reported having a supportive on-the-job mentor, opportunities to engage in meaningful tasks rather than the basic menial routine tasks, and excellent quality instruction in the classroom. Now, this is one of the places where we found a key difference between current apprentices and non-completers. In our study, the non-completers were less likely to report that they had a supportive on-the-job mentor. They were also less likely to report having systemic and social support for navigating harassment and or discrimination, and that really impacted their experience as an apprentice. Also, on the second bullet around opportunity for engaging in meaningful tasks, we saw a demographic difference. So our current apprentices and non-completers who identified as being Hispanic, Latino, Latina, or of Spanish origin were less likely to report having opportunities to engage in meaningful tasks and kind of had more basic or routine tasks. Now, sticking with the programmatic level in terms of challenges and barriers, costs was one that came up across all survey respondents. Challenges related to startup costs and ongoing costs emerged as a major challenge. Over 40% of our current apprentices shared that apprentices' wages are low and the startup costs can be high, and they don't necessarily tend to have savings, or they have limited savings to help them bridge that gap. Apprentices can find it challenging to balance that cost of living as and apprenticeship-related costs on a first year's pay. And it looks like I'm hiding a quote here. All right, so that's a quote from one of our open-ended questions as well, where they talk about, having to keep up with bills, supporting a small family, working 40 hours, all on an apprentice's wage can be very, very challenging. Moving on from here to the occupational level. So these are factors that play a role because of the nature of the job that the apprenticeship is about. And so at least 60% of respondents reported that they benefited from having an understanding of the demand for electricians in the United States. They also had clarity on the nature of the apprenticeship and the requirements for success. And they really understood what the average income potential was going to be. And they also understood the pay structure, knowing that, they're not going to start off at that average income potential. There's going to be a different pay structure as a first year versus a second year and so on. In terms of challenges and barriers, a third of our current apprentices and non-completer respondents wished that they had, wished that they had a clearer understanding of the nature of electrical work, what the actual work was going to be like, the cyclical nature of work, which is something that's very specific to inside wireman jobs, and also the startup and ongoing costs associated with apprenticeships like books and tools and travel and tuition. We saw another demographic difference here where current apprentices and non-completers that identified as non-white, or if they identified as Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin, they were less likely to report that they had an understanding of the role or the nature of electrical work or the pay structure or ongoing costs. So the whole point of us trying to get a really deep understanding for the factors that affect an apprentice's experience is to then lead us to insights that can help us better support those apprentices in a way that can set them up for success, and help retain them and help them get all the way through to completion. And so, we've broken these down by the different levels. Again, at an individual level, it's very clear to us from our research for this group of apprentices that there's a need for access to wraparound services, things like access to mental health services and childcare and transportation, if that's a big element of their apprenticeship program. At a programmatic level, there's a need for financial assistance, also access to effective on-the-job mentorship and support navigating things like harassment or discrimination can increase the odds of someone sticking with the program. And then at the occupational level, there's an opportunity for candidates to gain a better understanding, a more detailed, realistic understanding of what the apprenticeship is going to be about, but also making sure that that information is targeted towards demographically non-traditional candidates as well, and disseminated in a way that they would actually have access to that information. That is my last slide. And so, Harry, I will hand it back to you.
Brilliant, Key, Amy, thank you. There's a lot to unpack there. Like you had a lot of challenges and barriers, right? Which we'll get into in the discussion. I particularly want to pick up on that sort of not understanding the nature of the work and the particular occupation element and what we can do about it there. I'm gonna, before we get into that discussion, I'm gonna pass over to Jan and Melanie, who are going to talk about their experience and how their experience on the ground reflects a bit of the research that we've heard about.
Yeah,
So
thanks, Harry. So, Mel, I suspect you were nodding and going ditto, an awful lot as you were listening to G's presentation. I think, when Harry said to me, we'd really like to do another session focusing on retention and completion, the bell obviously went off in my head, because Melanie and the folks at Support Ontario Youth are the absolute poster children when it comes to those things. And we talk about them a lot in the course of our work. And so it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Melanie this afternoon to those of you who are on the call. And just for context, Harry opened up with comments about 60-ish% attrition being sort of the norm that we've convinced ourselves is not okay, but it's also not lighting anything on fire yet. In the context of 60-ish% attrition, Support Ontario Youth has been running less than 3% attrition over the last 6 years. And so I'll just let that sink in for a moment. It is possible, and it is possible through rethinking an awful lot of things that we sometimes take for granted. And so just in terms of rounding out the context before I hand it off to Mel, there's a couple of things I'd like to drive home. Some of you on this call might be inclined to think, okay, it's a Canadian story, things are different in Canada. They are not, I'm sorry to say. The terminology might be a little bit different. Mel might refer to ministry at certain times in her conversation with you. We're not talking about religion. In the Canadian context, we have ministries and ministers of labor. In the US, we have departments and secretaries of labor. And so it's really just a terminology difference between the two. Everything else, when we talk about how the industries are perceived, when we talk about the educational systems, when we talk about demographics and how retirements are running 5 times faster than we're replacing people out of the industry, when we talk about the administrative burden in apprenticeship, when we talk about the risks, when we talk about employer hesitation to actually commit for a whole bunch of reasons, there are no differences between the north and south side of the border. The reality that Mel and her team are contending with day in and day out is exactly the same reality as everybody else on this call is dealing with. So I'd caution you to say, well, it's Canada, because you know what, the reality is the realities are the same. And so in terms of quick backstory, and actually shout out, I don't know if Stephen Sell's on the call. I know Stephen was on the call last week talking about group sponsorship, but Stephen, when I came into contact with Support Ontario Youth, Stephen was the president of the Ontario Electrical League and the executive director at SOI. And the history there is the Ontario Electrical League is an industry association, as you can appreciate, made up of small and mid-sized electrical contractors who individually had a heck of a time finding apprentices, convincing people to be apprentices. And so the notion was, and Stephen, forgive me if I'm butchering it and collapsing a bunch of steps in the process, but it was an industry association. Here's the model I'd like you to take away with you. It was an industry association that made the decision to create a not-for-profit called Support Ontario Youth, with the express purpose of acting on behalf of their members to do what it took to build a workforce out of thin air for those members. And so from the very beginning, our role in that construct has been to lean into the technology that we originally created for employers to help them screen in happy and productive employees. Our role was to take that technology and twist it up a little bit, present it differently as a way to support SOI to screen in, well, first of all, to screen high volumes of people for fit in the electrical trade, and to use that as a lever to screen people into conversation with SOI who not only might be interested in learning more about what it would take to be an electrician and what that promised land could look like, but more importantly, to make sure that there was a strong degree of fit with the role, so that we were de-risking the process both for Support Ontario Youth and for the apprentice, so they could lean into the relationship with more confidence. And employers could do the same, because we were able to provide, through SOI, we were able to provide information to employers that helped them understand why somebody who might be a non-traditional candidate is worth taking a risk on. And so, from those early days, Mel, I know you're going to bring us up to speed, but I would say the infrastructure that you've built has grown considerably. You've created an ecosystem that supports both individuals and employers, and takes a lot of the bumps and friction out of all of the risk points that Amy and G presented earlier on. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can live up to that fantastic introduction. I'll do my best. While not obviously the focus of today's call, because you've already covered off the group sponsorship conversation, I can't let it go unnoticed that that's a big part of the reason why we know we are successful. Both the group sponsorship supports that provide guidance, mentorship, and resources to employers and apprentices within the ecosystem. But also, I would be remiss if I didn't give Jan and his team, obviously, the due shout out back. We have, as he indicated from the beginning of time, used fit first assessments, both the fit assessment and the problem solving and reasoning assessment, critical thinking assessment, to be able to determine whether or not the candidates that we are screening into our programs have both the fit and the ability to troubleshoot a problem until they find a solution. Because I think we can all agree that within apprenticeship and the trades in general, if you don't have troubleshooting knowledge, abilities, your skills, you are going to struggle, because many of the trades require a persistence to try to figure out a problem until it's solved. And so much so do we rely on Jan's team's assessments, that when we started to grow, when I joined SOI with Stephen 4.5 years ago, there was a team of 4. We are now a team of 26 at last count. And when we started growing the organization larger, we took into consideration using the fit assessment for how we built our team. And I can tell you from anecdotal evidence, both anecdotal from the world outside and my own personal experience of obviously working with my amazing team. When I go and take our team out to events, I am constantly bombarded with, you have a fantastic, dedicated, passionate team. And I will attribute a lot of that to the fact that we use Jan's assessments to build our internal team as we at Soy grow. Again, people send me resumes and I go get them to fill out the assessment. I want to see the fit first. And I didn't do that on purpose, but it kind of works, doesn't it, Jan? I won't look at a resume until I've seen the fit. So to kind of piggyback on some of the things that were touched on, yes, G and Amy, I was totally agreeing with everything that you guys were saying as we were going. Yes, nodding my head, because again, to Jan's point, we are just talking about geography. Systematic issues, obviously, within our apprenticeship system do still exist. And a lot of the things that were touched upon are things we hear are issues or barriers to completion. One of the big things that I want to touch on that does relate to some of the research that you brought up, that is something that we do find is somewhat limited because of the fact that we use the assessment, is and electrical is a great example because it's the one I use all of the time. In the Ontario system, we have several different versions of the electrical trade. Most specifically or most commonplace would be the construction sector and the industrial sector. So we have a construction electrician and an industrial electrician. When it gets right down to it, you're asking someone to learn the same skill sets. You know, a circuit is a circuit is a circuit. They're not different if you're in the construction trade or the the industrial trade. What is different is the environment. So if you are in the construction sector, chances are you are in all of the elements. In Toronto today, it's rainy and it's cold. We also have 40-degree temperatures in the summer and these are, sorry, Celsius, not Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees in the winter. So as a result, you would have to be expected to be exposed to all of those elements first and foremost. Industrial electricians generally get to hang out inside in a controlled, air-conditioned and heated manufacturing environment. On the construction side of things, you might be the only electrician on a job site, and you might go from one job site one day to another the next day to another the next day. Whereas as an industrial electrician in a manufacturing location usually is part of a team, is working alongside millwrights and other mechanics, troubleshooting a problem, sometimes under much more strict timelines. Every second that machine is down, that organization, company is losing money. And so I think I've drawn enough conclusions there for you to realize that you may be learning the same skill sets and be expected to deliver on the same competencies, but the actual environments are very, very different. And that's where the fit comes in. Because if you are more fit to be a person who is part of a team, who likes the stability of knowing where I'm going every day, what I'm going to be doing, and that it's going to be somewhat repeatable, the same thing, etc., you are more likely to be successful in one of those environments versus the other because of who you are as a person. It's the same way that I say that if I were a person who weren't comfortable with professional conflict, I wouldn't last in the job that I'm in, because there is that type of conflict that every leader has to deal with every day on the job. And yes, Jan did my fit before I got this job as well. After Stephen's departure, it was not lost on me that when I said, we really should use that when we're recruiting for the new person, and then they went, guess what? You're going to do it now. And I went, did you think that I wouldn't have applied if I didn't know that probably I'd be okay? So that thing around the fit and who the person is, I would say is the majority of why our retention rates are good, because apprenticeship is difficult regardless of how you get in who you have to support you. It is not yet an easy pathway. We are working in Ontario to try to modernize things and to improve it, but it's going to take time. It's a system that requires a lot of dedicated improvements to get to a place where it is really easy. And so for now, it's the situation of, are you a person that when the going gets tough, the tough is going to keep going? And again, that's why we believe that we do have such great retention rates, is that we're assessing on the front end whether or not that person is going to have the guts to stick it out until the end. A few other quick things that I'll touch on, because I know we're getting tight on time and I'm happy to answer more questions as we go, Harry. Mentorship was brought up as something that's really important. Again, huge agreements. Every single apprentice that comes into our group sponsor is given a technical mentor. So someone who's been through the journey, who is in the same trade that that apprentice is in, so that they can call and say, I have a problem. Can you coach me through this? Two reasons why that's important. Having someone outside of their employer network who potentially can give a different perspective. And also sometimes apprentices don't want to go back to their on-the-job trainer and say, can you explain this to me again? They've already asked 3 or 4 times to their on-the-job trainer. Having someone else outside their organization that they can go to is a huge benefit for them. Secondly, when apprentices go back to school in Ontario, they lose that connection to their employer. Therefore, they can't pick up the phone and say, I'm having a question issue with what I'm learning in theory today, because their trainer at work is expected to actually be working that day and can't just answer the phone. So we wanted to provide them with that resource and support to someone else outside of their network that they could get that from. On the mentorship side, every female apprentice that comes into our group, if her technical trainer is not a female journey person, we also assign them a female journey person. So my technical mentor in automotive, for example, is a male. If I hire a female, or if one of the employers that I work with hires a female apprentice, we will assign a female journey person. They may not have been in the same trade, but they have similar experiences about the differences between apprenticeship in the path that a female versus a male walks, and they're able to walk them through some of those potentially different and difficult circumstances that come up against them. I think I will leave it there for now, because I could talk about this all day. And Harry, did you want to focus some of the continued conversations, and I can sprinkle in where it makes sense?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mel and Jan. That was brilliant. I mean, I'd just go back to what Jan mentioned at the start. You know, your retention rate of 97% is amazing. So you're clearly getting a lot right. And yeah, it's really, I think if I had to kind of, you know, draw out a common theme between the whole discussion so far, like there's a lot of reasons, you know, there's a lot of factors behind non-completion, people dropping out. So you have to have like a, you know, quite nuanced and complicated approach, consider a lot of wide factors. And I think that's what, you know, what you're describing as fit, that kind of encompasses, there's a lot there to unpick. I want to start with a question that Matt asked in the sidebar. So we've talked about, you know, you ran through all the different challenges at the individual level, at the program level, at the occupational level. To what extent, how much of that is addressable in program design? Like how much can we just build good programs that account for these challenges?
An awful lot. I saw that comment from Matthew, and it kind of translated in my head is, isn't this avoidable? Yes, and also acknowledging that being said, that apprenticeship providers themselves are also often strapped for resources and time and constantly putting out fires. And it's one of those things where, like, one of my favorite analogies is like, you can't save for retirement if your roof's on fire. And, you know, if they're consistently putting out fires, some things kind of get missed out the cracks. And so, are some of these challenges avoidable? Yes. Do we want to take an apprentice kind of centered approach to designing apprenticeships, and would that kind of alleviate some of this? Absolutely. But it does take some concentrated effort and the ability to take 3 steps back to go, okay, what of this program is working for apprentices? What are their needs? What are their unmet needs? How can we put supports in place? What kind of partnerships do we want to bring to the table to kind of have our apprentices set up for success? I would just pause to see if Amy, if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I can add to that. Some programs, when they start, when they register a program, they get all this technical assistance on how to register, but they don't get the technical assistance for what happens after I have a program. And that additional assistance to help kind of figure out what they need to do for their orientation. What items should they use to have some of this stuff be avoidable for transportation or familiar support or mental health, or really looking at the occupation itself too, like making sure that they know that they have a team behind them and actually have that team behind them as well, and being able to have the program think through that. Besides thinking through how do I teach them the technical skills, how do I change do all the hours and all the requirements of registering, but then also how do I look at them as a human being too, and how do we show that we're not just an employer, but we are a training provider and we are somebody that will be able to provide supports. So you're asking a new sponsor, and I'm thinking this in the new sponsor context, to do a lot at the beginning. And so making sure that they have a lot of supports and that information up front could really help to look at the retention at the end.
I wanna expand on this point, and Jan, I wanna come to you on this one. Melanie talked earlier about, there's a lot about the occupation. You might be outside in terrible weather, or you might need to be able to deal with conflict, or you might need to be able to deal with repetitive tasks. So Jan, can you tell us a little bit about how does the fit assessment work? Like, how do you make that judgment about whether someone is a good fit? What are the things that you're trying to measure and look at there?
Yeah, so at the heart of it all, Harry, is some pretty sophisticated behavioral science, which, it's built on the Big Five model. I'd rather not get all geeky about that in this call, but it truly is built on science that's been around for a very long time. I mean, the Big Five model's been around for 30 years. It's still the most predictive body of science as it relates to helping predict whether somebody's likely to thrive in a particular role or not. And so, we're serving it up in a different way.
Can you give us the 30-second version of what the Big Five model is?
Yeah, a really quick example would be, something like extroversion. Right, that's one of the Big Five traits. Some people are naturally more introverted. Some people are naturally more extroverted, and statistically speaking, 68% of the population's in a mid-range. So back to Mel's example of different flavors of electrical occupations that all have the same designation, the same papers. Everybody completes the same training. Somebody who's an extrovert who thrives being around other people would do terribly poorly as a lineman, working on their own. It just wouldn't float their boat. And so, we measure it across a total of 25 behavioral traits. Extroversion is just one of them. And in the original work that we did with OEL and creating the patterns that were unique to them to screen in people who would be happy and productive in an OEL context with small and mid-size contractors, we studied some of their existing folks. We layered in some additional measures around tenacity and grit because we wanted to screen in people who were likely to see through the 5-year commitment to the trade. And so that's been what we've been working towards, and Mel's sort of elaborated it over the years to now serving 15 trades in different industries. And in every case, what we've done is created job patterns that are specific to the employers in that trade. Different point, related point, but different context would be, I was on a panel yesterday focused on disability, employment of people with disabilities with 2 representatives from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. IBEW is a huge union. I can tell you categorically, somebody who would thrive and do really well in an IBEW context looks different behaviorally than somebody who would thrive and do well in the context of the worlds that Mel's supporting. And so those are differences that we can measure. And it really truly is about, you know, sending people down pathways where they're likeliest to thrive.
That's a great point.
Sorry, Harry, Jan. Nadine just asked a question about biases. You might as well keep going.
Mel,
How do
what
you
you've done-
avoid
so-
biases in the fit? It's a blind assessment.
Yeah, well, it's a normative assessment, so it's calibrated against the general population. We've got hundreds of thousands of people in our database. The behavioral science team goes through on a regular basis to make sure that there's no adverse bias, and that we're actually screening in people who are going to be reflective of the, you know, their success in the job rather than the origin they come from. Our shorthand with employers when we're talking to them is, instead of guiding you to the resumes with the most best words in them, we're going to guide you to the humans in the applicant pool who are likeliest to thrive. And back to Nadine's question, it's going to sound tongue-in-cheek. It's not at all tongue-in-cheek. The resume introduces far more biases than the behavioral assessment ever could, if it's done right.
That's a good point.
I'm just pulling up my demographics. Currently, since the beginning of time, we've registered 1,327 apprentices. At current, there's 653 in those 15 trades that Jan mentioned that we look after, across 406 employers in the province of Ontario.
Done up.
And if I break that down in terms of my demographics, I have about 5% minority. Sorry, I'm literally doing this on the spot. So, and they were just updated. So give me a sec. I've got 2% Indigenous, 1% that are newcomer, 1% people with disabilities. And then I've got 14%, well, actually that's 25% that don't fit into any of the data, and 66 that did not disclose. So it's, I obviously can only give that to you and based on what people are willing to disclose, but gender wise, we are 93% male, shocking, and 5% female. But we're really proud of that 5% because that's actually above the average.
It's beating the average. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could take just a really quick small diversion, Harry. I mean, related to your question, back to yesterday's panel with IBEW. One thing that wouldn't show up in MEL stats, I'm sure, because in many cases it's undiagnosed and or unreported. IBEW has a lot of like a significant proportion of apprentices in their mix who are on the spectrum, to the point where, so back to G's presentation, you know, we talked about creating an inclusive workspace. We talk about mental health supports. We talk about the importance of mentorship and staying close to your apprentices over the course of their journey. You know, the folks that were on the panel from IBEW yesterday, that is their sole focus. That's what they do, is they stay close to these apprentices that are neurodiverse and yet thriving in certain pockets in that space. And, you know, as I think about, you know, shifting the focus, because we're talking about apprentices, I think the real value in talking about apprenticeship is thinking about it as a talent pipeline, right? That needs to start early. And Mel, you've invested in pre-apprenticeships, you've invested in outreach into the school districts and in the areas that you support, giving people the ability to test the idea for a while of whether this is a pathway that's going to be useful to them, giving them the idea to get hands-on and to play in a pre-apprenticeship for a period of time to give it a shot. You know, the ability to do that test drive before making the commitment is hugely important. And again, not to beat last week's drum, but a lot of the things that we're talking about in this call are really hard for an individual sponsor to do. I mean, it's all, I think, a really strong argument for creating a footprint sponsorship where you've got the presence and the resources and the heft to take on a lot of these activities.
Yeah, I really agree on that. I'm glad you both brought up the group sponsorship model and the parallels with this conversation. Just going back to the point on, you know, what can programs do to help? We've talked about a lot here. We've talked about, you know, the fit assessment, what you do, you know, before a program starting, make sure it's the right fit. We've talked about mentorship and support. What else should programs be thinking about? Like, what are the other things, other areas of support that programs need to be thinking about to get people
One of the
to
other
stay in a
big
program?
barriers to completion that we see is the actual final licensing exam. In Ontario, we call it the certificate of qualification. Across Canada, it would be equivalent to the Red Seal exam. So it's that final exam they have to write as part of their completion. We have a lot of people that get there